Hello everyone, and welcome to this conversation today with Wendy and Phil from Ofsted. Thank you for joining me to talk about childminder questions in relation to the new education inspection framework and the changes to the early years foundation stage for the 1st of September. Can I hand over to you to introduce yourselves, please?
Hi Sarah, thank you for inviting us. We're really pleased to join you today. My name's Wendy Ratcliff. I'm one of Her Majesty's inspectors, and I'm also Principal Officer for Early Education Policy.
Hi, thanks Sarah. My name's Phil Minns. I'm also one of Her Majesty's inspectors, and I'm a specialist advisor for early education, which covers early years and early primary as well.
Thank you. We've been out to childminder colleagues and we've collated lots of questions. So if we start with the first one, that is the one that comes up more often than any other question to Ofsted. How does Ofsted work towards consistency from one inspection to the next and from one inspector to the next, please?
Okay, so I think I'll start with this one. So I think it's really important that we're clear that our inspectors, they all inspect a variety of different types of settings, different sizes of provider, that may be from large nurseries to smaller childminder settings. And all inspectors use the Early Years Inspection Handbook, our education inspection framework, when conducting those inspections. And it's the handbook that outlines everything that happens on an inspection, right from that notification call all the way through to the publication of the final report. And where necessary, it reflects the, that variety of providers that we have in early years. And I think it's important that, there is no kind of other guidance out there. Everything that we do on an inspection is published in that handbook. It's there. There's no other secret guidance or anything that we've got behind the scenes. And of course, inspectors will act fairly and without bias at all times. And their judgments are based on the evidence that they gather on inspection. And we've got a variety of quality assurance processes in place. We train all our inspectors. And through those quality assurance processes, of course, we make sure that the judgments that are reached are fair and supported by evidence.
And perhaps just sort of going back to what Wendy said there about the fact that our inspection handbook is published. The reason we do that is so that everyone knows what we're doing. So we're sort of very open, like Wendy said, we've got nothing else that we use. So if people really want to know what inspections are like and what should happen, then the best thing to do is to read the handbook. And that will not only tell you what should happen, but then if things happen during your inspection where you think, oh, didn't think this was going to happen, you can ask the inspector. And that's part of the openness that we would have. And if during an inspection, somebody who's being inspected doesn't understand why the inspector's asking for something, it's entirely their right to ask about that and to say, can you explain that to me? We want it to be as open and as fair as it can be. That's
really empowering for the provider. Thank you for clarifying that one. That is really good. I think we all feel a little bit of anxiety. I know before my last inspection, I found myself cleaning behind the fridge. Figure that one. But we do read providers who have genuine Ofsted anxiety and who will cite Ofsted as the reason for leaving childminding. Do you have anything you can say to reassure colleagues, please?
So I think, the important message there is, and I know it probably seems easy enough for me to say, as an inspector, is that, please don't be nervous. And, inspectors do recognise that there is that kind of, people do feel nervous when it's time for their inspection. But again, I think it goes back to what that previous answer is around, our inspection handbook's there so that, have a look at that, have a read in terms of what is it that the inspector will want to do on inspection, so that you've got that understanding and you've got that expectation about what an inspector will or won't want to see. And of course, there's the notification call. the notification call is the best place to start building that professional relationship with the inspector and to ask those questions that you've got about the inspection. Phil, is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, it just, I mean, it's interesting, Sarah, you said about cleaning behind the fridge, isn't it?
Not quite sure why you would want to clean, but anyway, yeah.
Yeah, but it's a bit like when people come around to visit, isn't it? I mean, you want things to look nice, but actually, on an inspection, the way that you want to deal with an inspection is by sort of dealing with the same stuff every day. You know, what you want to do first and foremost is to be looking after those children really, really well, making sure that they're well cared for and learning loads. And doing that every day, that's what we're interested in when we're coming in to inspect. We're not interested with, we might look at the back of your fridge. I don't know. I doubt it. But actually, what we're interested in is when we look at these children and when we see what's happening in your place, are these is what we're seeing telling us that these children are well looked after and learning lots on every day. It's not on the day that we're there. Inspection isn't a performance where, you know, on that day you'll get good or not good based on what happens on that day. It's very much actually what we're interested in is what do these children get every day. So yes, we understand that people are nervous and anxious, but in a way, I suppose that's inevitable because you care about what you do and you know that what you do is important in the same way that we do. It's why we inspect, isn't it? It's because we know that what you do is important. So that's why it's important enough to be inspected. So we recognise that people will be nervous, and our inspectors really understand that. Many of them have come from the background themselves, so they know what that's like. But from your point of view, as somebody who's being inspected, what we want to try and do is make you realise that what we're interested in is what happens every day, not necessarily just what happens on that inspection day.
I think that's a really important point. And, you know, ultimately, as inspectors, we're charged with finding out what it's like to be a child in this place. What's it like? And the best way of doing that is for you as a childminder to carry on and do what you would usually do, and don't try to do anything different just because the inspector calls.
Absolutely. We know there's a new bit in the inspection at the moment about COVID.
Yes.
We've read about that. What sort of questions are you asking providers? Are you asking about our response to it, whether we've had to close? What sort of things are you focusing on?
You'll know that we've recently updated the handbook with it's kind of like a bit of a, I suppose we kind of refer to it as a kind of COVID overlay. We've added that section, inspection during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that really, and again, there's the version there that we've published ready for use from September as well. And it just explains the slight differences to notification and inspection safety. There's no change to our education inspection framework methodology. So those types of activities that we do as inspectors on the inspection, or to the criteria. We just recognise that there's been this disruption clearly to providers, and recognise, you know, the sterling job that people have been doing all the way through the pandemic. But what we're interested in is kind of like any impact that might have had on children's learning. So we'd be interested to find out what it is that you've done to mitigate that, I guess, and thinking about anything that you're doing to ensure that any, I suppose, lost learning or anything that children have missed out on, that you're able to help them get back on track. And so they're ready for what comes next in terms of their education.
So that's things like sharing information with parents, like the Hungry Little Minds website, or reading books online for the children while they were on lockdown.
Yeah, but we won't.
That.
Yeah, absolutely. But what we won't be doing is we won't be making judgments on what you did during the pandemic when you might have been closed, or, you know, arrangements you might have had with keeping in touch with parents, for example. What we're interested in is, you know, as children have come back and they're with you, how have you identified what it is that you need to focus your attention on to make sure those children are in the place they need to be in terms of ready for the next stage. Phil,
That's
I don't
really
know if you want to
helpful.
add
Yeah.
anything into that.
Yeah, no, it's just really saying again what Wendy said. You know, we're not inspecting what happened during the pandemic. That's not part of what we're doing. We'll be interested to understand the impact of it on the children, and then what you're wanting to do to make up for that. You know, so we know that some children will have missed out. Some children will have continued to be with people throughout. Other children won't. Some children will have, you know, might have gone back in some areas. They might have been, you know, speaking in full sentences before, and when they come back, they might not be doing it that anymore. So what we're interested in is, you know, what's been the impact, if you like, on the children, and how are you helping those children to catch up again? How are you helping those children to remember to do the things that they used to be able to do that they might have forgotten?
Okay, that's really reassuring. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, that's good. If I can take us back a little bit to the last inspection cycle, when the EIF was first introduced, so those inspections between September 20 and April 21, we note that Ofsted introduced intent, implementation and impact into the inspection handbook. And we note that we've sort of translated that to plan, do, review a little bit. What are Ofsted finding now in inspection as they're out there, and what are you actually looking for in relation to the 3 I's?
Okay. Phil, do you want to go with that one?
Yeah, I mean, we can, you know, our understanding of a curriculum, which is you know, the curriculum is simply how you decide what you want your children to learn and when you want them to learn it. So that's, you know, basically what we'd say a curriculum was. Our understanding of that, which we developed and sort of looked into further for the launch of the inspection, the education inspection framework in September 2019, that is still the basis of our inspection work. So we're still looking at, you know, that idea of intent. So what do you want your children to learn? Then the implementation about how well you're actually delivering that and sort of doing that on a day-to-day basis. And then the impact, you know, this whole thing about how do you know that what you wanted them to learn, they're learning? And that's still very much the basis of what we're doing. People don't need to worry about sort of our definitions there, because we will have conversations with you where we're trying to understand that, and often we won't be saying, you know, describe your intent. Often what people are saying is, you know, what do you want your children to learn by the time they leave you? Where do you want them to be? You know, what do you want them to be able to do physically? What sort of you know, in that we're thinking about their personal, social, emotional development, where do you want them to be? And language communication, all of these areas we're looking at. So that's more like the sort of conversation. And then what we'll do is we'll take that on to explore. So, okay, so you said you want your children to be, you know, physically confident and to develop a lot of gross motor skills. And how are you doing that? And then we'll look to see how that's working, and then look to see if we can see that happening, you know, and the impact that's having on the children. You know, whether the children are actually demonstrating that they can remember the things that we're talking about. So that's very much the same. What we know from some of the work that we did and conversations that we had with providers and childminders and others during the sort of when would that be, the sort of autumn last year, we know that people began to tell us that they were worried that some children were coming in, they'd sort of slipped in perhaps their communication and language. Other people were saying that areas of their PSED weren't really where they wanted them to be. And what we've found is that since going back out and talking to people about that now in settings, it's very much, you know, people have identified those gaps, and then we're interested in what they're doing about it. So, you know, perhaps they've prioritized some things. You know, we used to you know, we used to go to the park every afternoon or something, but you know, we know that this particular child who I'm looking after hasn't really been out. They live in a flat. They haven't really been out very much. So actually we're doing even more of that now, because I want them to catch up and I know where I want them to get to. So it's that sort of conversation we're having. Wendy, what do you think? Have I missed?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's really, really important. And I think it is around, you know, we want to find out how do you decide what it is that you want your children to learn, and how then you will go about making sure that they do that. and they get off to that really good start. And thinking around, you know, some of those things that, you know, providers told us when we spoke to them in autumn 2020 as part of those that research, the briefings that we published, that actually, you know, if you have discovered that, you know, some children need to hear more words because their language has slipped, how are you going about that? What is it that you're doing? It's about having the confidence to let inspectors know, you know, any changes that you've made, or how you're ensuring children get to where you want them to be.
It goes back to actually to something we said before. One of the conversations we had with somebody during that autumn term when we were finding out more was they said that when the children came back, they realised they'd forgotten some things that they used to be able to do, and so what they were doing was they were really focusing on helping them to remember to do it. And I think that's a really nice way of seeing it. It's not that they've unlearned it. It's not that they've, you know, that sort of abandoned that bit of knowledge. It's just that they didn't have to remember it during that time, and so now we're helping them to remember. And particularly, it's interesting when we think about intent and implementation. Often people have got perhaps a clearer idea of that for themselves in areas of personal, social, emotional development. You know, like manners, saying please and thank you, things like this, where they really, really expect that to happen, and they really, you know, the way that they have this idea that they want children to speak politely, take turns, say thank you, say please, and the way they implement that part of their curriculum is they expect children to do it all the time, and that's often, and then you can tell that it's worked because those children say thank you. You know, so there's a really neat loop there, and often people don't think that that's a curriculum. But from our point of view, that's exactly a curriculum, because what people have done is they've thought about what they want children to learn. They've decided in their head, by the time they leave this place, I want them to be able to say please and thank you and, you know, all these other things. And then every single day, they help the children to learn how to do it and to remember to do it. And then we can see when we're looking at those children whether the extent to which they've remembered it or not. So that's a really, you know, that's one way of looking at the curriculum. And I think some people would forget that actually we would see that as much of part of a curriculum as anything to do with any other aspect of learning.
That's a really good example, Phil, actually, and really good example of, you know, that's kind of, you know, we know that, you know, our inspection, the types of things that we do on inspection is, you know, through observation, through the discussions that we have, and actually, you know, that's evidence that learning's taking place.
So it's not about going out and writing a big long curriculum or writing progression lists, or it's knowing what you're doing and doing it every day.
Do what you do. Yeah, do what you do every day. That's what we want to see on inspection.
And I think sometimes people so that sort of example of the manners, if you like, or politeness. Sometimes people don't realise that actually that's exactly what you do in other areas as well. So if you want them to be able to count, you just make sure that, you know, you've thought that in your head, that by the time they leave you want them to be able to count to 10 or whatever it is that you want them to do, and you want them to be able to do that securely and really confidently, and regardless of the size of the things or what they are. And we just count a lot of things. You know, we take every opportunity we get to count, which is exactly the same, isn't it? And that's
the
how we
oneness of one, the two-ness of two, and
Absolutely. So when we're looking at impact or the progress children are making from their starting points, we've always thought about tracking, haven't we? It's become synonymous with record keeping, writing things down, ticking lists, keeping records. And Ofsted, how the messaging is coming out here that you want to know from the practitioner, but what sort of questions will you be asking childminders to sort of draw out what the children know and can do?
So I think what's really important there is around inspectors will want to find out the story of that child. So wanting to find out what they knew and what they could do when they started with you at the childminders, and then thinking about actually then what is it that they can do now and how have you got them to that point, and then thinking about what your plans are for that child so that they're ready for wherever their next stage leads them, whatever their next stage of learning is. So it's kind of like, how, you know, as children arrive, how do you find out what it is that they know and can do? what is it that where do you want to get them to, and what do they do, what can they do now that they couldn't do before, and what are your plans moving forward? So it's really finding out that story of that child, and that doesn't involve, from our point of view, any form of tracking or progress documentation, shall we say.
I mean, we know that you might choose to use some for yourself, but what, you know, the key message that we've been delivering a lot over this inspection framework is that childminders and other people working with young children shouldn't be doing anything for Ofsted. You shouldn't do anything for Ofsted. You should be doing it for the child. So if you think you need it because it's going to help you make sure that that child or those children, you know, are where you want them to be, then yeah, do it. But if you think you're doing it for Ofsted, then don't, because we don't need that. And what we will find is that we can have a conversation with you about these children, and that will tell us far more about what you know and how well you know these children than any piece of paper ever could. Because we know as soon as we start talking to you, you know how well people know children, don't you? I mean, you can tell that from the conversation, and that's what we're interested in. And as Wendy said, it's, you know, one of the things that the trouble with some assessment stuff is that it takes you away from actually that engagement with the children. And actually that's what's really important, is the contact and the involvement that you have with the children is what's the most important thing. So anything that takes away from that, you know, has to be really important, you know, and we would argue that actually you knowing the child and really helping them to learn every day is much more important than any sort of remote tracking or assessment information that's going on,
or a tick list of something, or
yeah.
So for example, on my last inspection, I have an action to better record next steps for children's progress. When I'm looking to inspection next, and I've got that as an action, what should I be thinking about? Because now I know that you're not going to be looking at my record keeping. I could explain next steps, but the inspector was specifically looking at my little form and saying, well, I don't think that highlight's good enough there. It really needs to be separate so it can be shared with parents in a different way. So should I be coming away from that feeling that I need to record for Ofsted and just be confident in how I verbalise it now? And I suppose that goes for any reports people have where the advice was to record.
I think one of the things there is ultimately it's entirely up to you how you decide and choose to do that. And in terms of, you know, one of the things that, you know, inspectors will ask about, you know, what have you done since your last inspection? How have you addressed those areas, you know, for improvement, and what have you done about that? So, but actually, so they'll be interested to know that how are you aware of their next steps, rather than the piece of paper that might be written on, if that makes sense, because it's entirely up to you how you do that, and it's entirely up to you how you provide that information to parents and communicate that to parents as well. Because of course, you know, your partnership with parents, you know, you'll be engaging with parents and supporting parents to support children's learning at home, and how you go about that, again, entirely up to you.
So we can reassure our colleagues that they can move away from documentation unless they find it has value for them and the parents and the children.
Yeah.
And what we're saying, you know, get back to the floor, get back to play. Reassuring.
Do the right thing, do what's best for the children. And, you know, and I think EYFS is clear, it's clear now, and the EYFS that comes in September is also really clear about assessment and the assessment of young children, that it shouldn't involve excessive paperwork, and it shouldn't involve taking that time away from those important interactions. That's what's important. The interactions with children. Adults should be there with the children and not be, you know, ticking boxes on a spreadsheet.
And that's the other thing, you know, one of the things that we've got in this handbook, which we've really sort of clarified, is what progress is. And progress isn't about tick sheets or tracking. Progress is about being able to do something and remember how to do it. So if we've got a baby or a toddler who's learnt to stack some cups, then the evidence that they can do it is that they can actually do it. It's not that they did it once and by accident, yeah, and we've got a photo of it. Actually, the evidence is that they can do it, isn't it? So the evidence then becomes the fact that they can do it, and now they're going on to the next thing. And sometimes the sort of gathering of evidence, if you like, which we know has been driven a bit by Ofsted, and that's one of the reasons why we changed things in this inspection framework. We know that actually what's more important isn't that we've got a photograph of that one, accidental occurrence when they stack the cups. What's much more important is that that child can do it and they enjoy it and they can show people and they can do it again and again and again. So it's really focusing on that, what the child can do and remember, rather than maybe a one-off bit of evidence that might or might not tell us that they can do it.
On a post-it note or a photo, yeah.
So, sorry, go on. We're going to.
No, I was just going to come back and just say about the paperwork thing, and the photographs and all that stuff. We're not saying that you don't want to do it, and I know when about 200 years ago, I was a reception teacher, and if I didn't write it down, I forgot it. Yeah. So I did write stuff down, and I probably wrote down more than I needed to, purely because I wasn't able to keep all that in my brain. So we're not saying that you can't record anything and take the photos and do it whatever you like. What we're saying is that we're not going to look at that information. Don't do it for us. Only do it for, if you think it's helping you with those children.
Yeah. If it's helpful for you, if it's, if it's serving the purpose that it's making a difference it's the right thing to do for the children.
Yeah. Do it for the children.
So we're not saying stop. We're not saying don't do anything. Just do the right thing that's right for your children, for yourselves, in terms of, workload, so it's manageable. Don't do it because you think Ofsted wants to see it.
That's really reassuring for our colleagues who maybe have dyslexia or who feels that they need to write things down for themselves because they may want to read from it during inspection. I recognise that Ofsted will allow them to do that under the reasonable adjustments in the Equality Act, but they still sometimes get a little nervous that they're just going to be expected to talk without any reference point.
I think that's something really important there. Ultimately, inspection's not a memory test.
Yeah.
If you want to refer to something that you've written down, if you're having that discussion about that child and you're kind of, oh, my mind's gone blank. Well, actually, if you've written it down because you write it down and that's what you do, then you can look at it, refer to it and use it. But that's entirely up to you. We're not, what I think the important thing is don't do it because you think Ofsted wants to see it.
That's brilliant. Thank you. It really clears that one up. With reference, we were just talking about previous inspection reports. We've got quite a few colleagues asking about signage and labels outside. They've got this action on their inspection report. Do inspectors under the EIF now look at your inside outside provision in terms of what you've got displayed, what you've got on labelling, or are they more focusing on what's it like for a child here and asking you why you do or don't have something available?
I think that goes back to what we've said earlier in terms of, how do you decide what it is that you want your children to learn? And that is ultimately what we're interested in on inspection. What is it you want your children to learn? How are you going to make sure that they get to where they need to be? And then what is it that you want to do next? So it's not about it's more about what is it, rather than things and activities and the environment, as it were.
Mm-hmm. And also we know that communication and language is so important, and we know that within that it's really important that children have a big vocabulary, that they learn lots of words, because we know that makes a huge difference to them, and it really helps them to be able to name so many different things, because by naming those things, by having the word for that thing that they can see, they're actually lodging that sort of concept, that information in their brain. And the way that children get that is by talking. That's by listening to adults describe things, tell them stories, chat, sing. That's where the language and the vocabulary is so important. Labels and written words for those young children, might help, they might not. We don't, but the key is really that quality of conversation that's going on, chatting about stuff, talking about things, describing things, talking about what's going on, telling a good story, singing a song, reading some rhymes, doing, all of those, that is the talk. That's what's key for these young children. So, labels might or might not help in that. I mean, but as very much sort of in second place, really, to all of that chat.
That's my typical day.
Yep. And that's the joy of it as well, isn't it? That's the lovely thing.
The importance of those key interactions.
Yeah,
absolutely.
because they learn so much from you, don't they? And they need to hear those words over and over and over again, so they really understand what they mean. So they understand that that red isn't just the color of the mug or the flower, but it's also can be applied to other things. All of that. The way they get that big body of knowledge is by chat and talk and reading and singing and everything.
Absolutely. Oh, we love it. Can the child with the starry socks go next in the queue? And then we can get some maths in there as well, because you never miss an opportunity for maths. Do we have any guidance on length of inspections since you've been back to inspecting? We know the inspection handbook says around 3 hours. We have some colleagues 2.5-hour inspections, some colleagues reporting 5-hour inspections. I just wondered if there's any messaging coming out about that. Or...
I think one of the things that's really important there is that those timescales that we give in the handbook, they're a guide, and what we know, of course, is that each inspection is different. We know that the majority of inspections, they usually last around 3 to 4 hours, but that does very much depend on what's happening and the circumstances at the time, depend on the number of children there may be present, whether or not you're working with an assistant, whether or not partway through the inspection you need to go out and do the school run. So I think in terms of inspecting childminders per se, it's kind of like, the handbook gives that guide of around 3 hours, but obviously inspectors will adapt that depending on what's happening in individual inspections.
So it's exactly the same really as saying, well, the nursery down the road got this action, so I've got to do it. Well, that might not be relevant to you.
No.
Maybe looking for something different.
Yeah.
It's that sort of idea, isn't it?
Absolutely. And what's really important is that ultimately, when we're inspecting, the needs of the children come first, and it may be on that particular day, well, a particular child needs your focus on something, and that may actually extend the inspection by half an hour, because it's important that you do whatever it is that child needs.
And that's the bottom line, isn't it? The children come first in this.
Can we talk about ratios, please?
Yes.
I'd like to just get some messaging out for childminders about where Ofsted are coming from with ratios at the moment, because it's been really helpful in the past.
Okay, so I think let's just be really clear here, because it's the early years foundation stage, as we know, Sarah, don't we, that sets out those requirements, and it sets out the ratio requirements for childminders. And there is some flexibility around ratios already within the EYFS. So it's paragraph 3.30. I think it's a bit sad that I know that paragraph off by heart. But at any one time, childminders may care for a maximum of 6 children under the age of 8. They can't exceed that maximum. But actually, if a childminder can demonstrate to parents and to Ofsted inspectors when we call that the individual needs of all children are met, exceptions to the usual ratios can be made. And that may be, there are some examples listed within the EYFS, and that may be when they're caring for their own children or sibling babies, or to maintain continuity of care. one of the things we know is that our colleagues at the DfE are really clear that they are examples, that, you know, that when an exception may be made, but that's not all the examples. It's not exclusive. They're not the only times that you can do that. I think what's really important is that bit about being able to meet the individual needs of all the children that you're caring for, and being able to provide, you know, for their learning. And just because you can, that doesn't mean that you should. You need to be able to meet the individual needs of all those children.
I think that strapline has been so useful. I remember we did a discussion back in January 2020 and it was on a slide. And ever since then, we've repeated it. It's not about, you know, I've got 4 or I've got 5, so you should be able to too. It's whether you can support the learning and care needs of every child. And just because
every day, absolutely. And it's not just because it's written down in the EYFS that gives that flexibility there. Just because it says you can doesn't mean that you should. Because actually, you know, can you meet all the needs of those children? Can you get everybody out on the school run? Can you provide for their learning and development? You know, are you having those important interactions with every single child? Is it the right thing to do? And that's what, and inspectors, if we come across that on inspection, that's what we're interested in. Not that, you know, is it the right thing to do for those children? And can you demonstrate that you're meeting those children's individual needs and providing them with, you know, the learning that they need?
Brilliant. That's really clear. Thank you, Wendy. Was there anything else Ofsted wanted to talk about in terms of trends coming through inspection reports, or anything you've noted since you've been back to inspecting that might support colleagues?
I was going to say that's one of the things that we're actually, you know, we do keep a very close eye on. We do kind of, you know, monitor, you know, how inspections are going and what the overall picture is, and that's something that we're actually looking at. But I don't think yet we're in that position that we would, you know, be able to say anything in particular. And it's something that, you know, we do have processes in place, and we look at that. We look at what, you know, what's coming out from inspection and share that information. But we're not yet in that position that we would be sharing anything.
I think that's really useful. Thank you. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Phil, for a brilliant discussion this morning. You have kindly said that other colleague questions will be answered maybe through childcare registration or as a sort of a little Q&A. We very much appreciate that as well. And we do have childcare registration to whom we can go if we have questions, and the team there are brilliant and getting back to us quickly with answers.
Yeah, through the Facebook. Yeah, so that's the Facebook page, isn't it, Sarah? Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you both.